Okay, hello everyone. Before I start, can I ask you, how many of you have heard the term freedom of mind before? You could raise your hand. Okay, have you all heard it in this context, in the context of cults? Is that a yes? True? Okay, so freedom of mind is actually first used in the literature at the end of the 16th century. It also appears in the American Revolutionary War, the idea that the psychological bonds that impinge upon us are more powerful than the physical ones. It also appears in anti-colonial, anti-segregation writings that freedom of mind is the real freedom, far more powerful than the physical constraints. It appears in Buddhist writings, the idea that the mind should be free from the raw and uncontrolled processes, in other words, that the mind should be free from itself, effectively. At its best, as in psychiatry at its best, freedom of mind is about finding an appropriate balance of freedom within the mind. And of course, in the cult world. So in the 1990s, a European Union body called for an agreement to protect people against the acts by authoritarian cults that were impinging upon our freedoms. Unfortunately, since the 90s and onwards, there's been a diffusion of destructive cult mind control techniques. These mind control techniques have moved from the private sector into the political scene, into politics and government, and also business. The cult leader's playbook goes mainstream. This isn't a truism, but it will be soon. The case in which Trump came to power is a case in point. Okay, so when Donald Trump came to power, a group of mental health professionals who are known as the World Mental Health Coalition, they came together to warn against the dangers that Trump posed to the American population and also the wider world. They produced the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which some of you may know. At the time of the first impeachment of Trump, the World Mental Health Coalition warned the policymakers pushing for the impeachment of Trump, that they had to take into account the psychological nature of the problem. Unfortunately, their advice wasn't heeded by those pushing the impeachment, and in response, the World Mental Health Coalition released the first declaration of freedom of mind in history. It begins by asserting that freedom of mind is a basic human right, it's at the core of all freedoms and it's fundamental to democracy, and then it's derived from the international rights agreements that preceded it. So, human rights have two types of freedoms. They have negative freedoms, a freedom from some violation or impingement, and freedom to, so a right to access a service or entitlement. The Declaration of Freedom of Mind, the Declaration, outlaws all the main variants of mind control. It defines mental slavery as an absence of agency over one's mind and issues an unequivocal prohibition. And it also creates an unqualified right or unqualified prohibition that abridging of the speech, the press, or access to expertise in relation to matters of mental health there are no derogations to that prohibition. The freedoms too is the right to full access to information in order to make informed decisions for oneself. The prerequisite for that is that the individual should have full access to information and, importantly, the best available knowledge, including expertise from mental health experts. There's a right to develop psychologically, to actualize your critical thinking skills and reach one's full mental potential with an internal locus of control, not an external locus of control, for example. And also to participate personally or through a representative in shaping laws that protect freedom of mind. Okay, human rights have a foundational hierarchy to them. The rights build upon each other. In order to think freely, in order to have freedom of speech, you must have freedom of thought. And in order to think freely, the mind must be free in the first place to have that thought. Freedom of mind thus provides for the rights that precede it. Okay. Interestingly, freedom of mind isn't mentioned anywhere in the international human rights text. Nowhere is it stated explicitly. However, in a number of United Supreme Court rulings, it is mentioned. Freedom of mind is not defined, but it is specified, along with freedom of thought, as a prerequisite for other First Amendment rights, namely freedom of speech. Okay. There are three main mechanisms of international law. There are treaties and covenants which have binding legal force. There is customary international law, which is the notion that the consistent practice of states over time generates a corresponding legal obligation. And there are declarations, which are by their nature declaratory and do not have legal force, hard law and soft law. Okay, so these are the main international treaties guaranteeing human rights, and this is the Declaration of Freedom of Mind. This is the path it must follow. However, the case must not be equivocal. There is a phenomenon called human rights inflation, which is that the ever-expanding set of human rights in some way could weaken the rights that came before it. Rights inflation needn't be dangerous, but it can be dangerous in some respects. So a number of criteria have been created to guard against this danger. I believe that human rights meets all of these conditions and then some. However, there is one additional and most important criterion that freedom of mind must meet. It must not undermine the existing international human rights regime. Why is this a problem? Human rights are under threat from a number of powerful actors who are arguing that not only Western power, but the human rights political order has failed. This is a problem because any declaration of freedom of mind must be negotiated at the international level, and agreement must be arrived at. This presents an opportunity for opponents of human rights to push back against the existing set of rights and to weaken the existing system. So the danger in negotiating a declaration is that we end up with a system that is weaker than currently. There is another way, which is easier in the short term. So each of the United Nations treaty bodies is tasked with interpreting the set of rights, fleshing them out and applying them to specific situations. And they produce general comments or general recommendations. So we take the provisions that are in the Declaration of Freedom of Mind and we upstream them into the existing human rights texts. One of the most effective ways that international treaties can protect against the problem is to name the problem. We need to name the problem. We need to name mind control. We need to name undue influence. We need to name coercive control. Okay. For example, the UDHR says that the family is entitled to protection. Protection from what? There is a law currently in the process, going through the New Jersey Parliament about predatory alienation, which is the act of isolating a victim from their family and friendships. We could, for example, add a general comment specifying that this protection applies to predatory alienation. Okay. In 2007, Evan Stark produced a book called Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, where he created a model of coercive control: isolation, intimidation, and control. The outcome of that is what he calls unfreedom or entrapment. In 2015, the world's first coercive control law was passed, and now it's spreading rapidly across the world. This map is actually now out of date. Well, I should say it's spreading rapidly across the democratic world. Okay. The different coercive control laws across the world apply to they have a different remit. The England and Wales law is the most expansive in that it can apply beyond an intimate romantic relationship. It can apply, for example, between two family members. The next step will be to expand the coercive control laws that exist already to apply to groups. The Family Survival Trust have produced a memo or a report outlining how this could take place. Okay. Coercive control is, if we understand it as force, intimidation, threat, it doesn't cover the full extent of mind control. You don't need to use force, threat, or intimidation to unduly influence or manipulate someone. Okay. In About 7 years ago, law professor Alan Shefflin predicted the developments of mind control throughout the world. He predicted that coercive control would spread rapidly as a criminal offence, leaving undue influence for the civil realm. And he wasn't far off. The biggest progress has been with coercive control and undue influence to a lesser extent. Okay. Undue influence is defined, has traditionally been defined very narrowly, applying mostly to wills and trusts and also to guardianships and conservatorships. This is reflected in the international treaties. The only mention of undue influence in the international treaties applies to persons with disabilities. However, undue influence isn't set in stone. In 2014, California passed a new law redefining undue influence, specifying it as excessive persuasion that can overcome a person's free will, and that the instigator of undue influence can be a spiritual advisor. Okay. California was also the testing ground for creating a criminal offence, unsuccessfully, of undue influence. And there was a case in New York a few years ago where a woman brought a case against her spiritual advisor alleging undue influence, and the court allowed it to go ahead, drawing upon past legal cases involving a religious or spiritual advisor. Okay, freedom from slavery. Slavery is specifically prohibited in the UDHR and the ICCPR. However, it says slavery in all their forms shall be prohibited. It's not clear whether this is referring to mental slavery. So the Declaration of Freedom of Mind, which upgrades the provision in the UDHR, this could be upstreamed into the existing treaties. Other examples, the right to privacy, or freedom from torture, these are other areas where we could upstream the protections that are emerging in national law. To democracy, right to mental health, these are other areas where we could upstream. Okay. Freedom of thought is the most explicitly protected mind right in international law. However, freedom of thought is not defined in any of the treaties, and nor is it defined in any of the background working papers for human rights. The UN Special Rapporteur for freedom of thought, he drew attention to this, and he reminded us, or he brought it to attention, that freedom of thought was undefined and that it should be redefined, including by adopting a general comment. So there were several submissions from a number of individuals and organizations. However, not a single cult expert contributed to this. So there's a real dearth of knowledge from the sector of cults and mind control that is missing in the United Nations, is missing from dialogue with the United Nations. I say this as someone with a partial background in law. More law and more incarceration certainly is not the answer. We need to get to the root. We need to get to the cause. Dealing with the condition is not enough. Authoritarianism, before it becomes a political problem at the governmental level, it is a social problem at the group level. And I contend it should be seen as a psychological disorder at the national level. There is an operating an assumption among rights advocates that the human spirit needs to be free. Stephen Hassan wrote about this, that there is a basic universal or psychological metaphysical need to be free. After all, who would choose willingly to be lied to or exploited? I'll show a brief video clip. This is a clip of someone from the Children of God, and she describes her experiences growing up in the cult as a second-generation member.
There's this constant squelching of your spirit. So here you are, a teenage girl starting to develop, and you're the early stages of carving out your identity and trying to experiment. And I could feel in me this deep unhappiness. We all rebel, it's innate. And it was a fury against the destruction that they had wreaked on my life. And I wasn't going to take it anymore. I was done being a product of their abuse. My moment of realization of what am I doing here was in inspiration time. And there's 50 people in a room singing. And I just looked around and just saw hypocrisy, falsehood, and I just started miming. I stopped singing. I just started faking it. We were extremely poor and extremely cold, and I was being sex trafficked to very influential or affluent people. And that was terrifying. In fact, I started getting ill, a lot of abdominal pains. My body was screaming, "This is wrong, get out." There was a bus at 5:20 in the morning. I managed to open the front door. And it's like this feeling of, being eyes staring at you from behind. That's almost like pulling you back. The weight kind of slowly drops into your stomach, and the further you go, sort of the lighter you feel. Like those scenes from films of migrants who have found a little dinghy and they finally reach the shore. Like that, really. And suddenly I felt relief and gratitude. And a lightness of being. And freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. Freedom from control. Nobody else is telling you what to do anymore.
So she talks about how, despite having no external frame of reference, she was born in the group, she didn't know what was being done to her was wrong, and she was having these extreme physical or physiological reactions. So she says here, I started getting ill, abdominal pains, my body was screaming, this is wrong, get out. So there is something within us that rebels against being violated, even when we don't have any knowledge of why or how it's wrong.
A Texas jury has sentenced polygamous leader Warren Jeffs to life in prison plus 20 years. The jury heeded the prosecutor's call to give Jeffs the maximum sentence for sexually assaulting an underage follower he took as his bride. Jeffs led a radical offshoot of the Mormon Church.
Almost every room has a picture. We love him.
And how would you describe Uncle Warren, as you call him?
As a father. He is a very loving, caring, oh wow. Sorry. It's so deep and so real and so much love and kindness that it hurts to think that anybody could see bad in him. I know the real story. I know the real man. And he's had a lot of bad press. And he's had a lot of things said that just, they don't hold true. He's done only good that I know of in my life.
And there's never within you a seed of doubt?
Absolutely not.
You are an educated person. You are not a blind mouse following not knowing better. And you've never once had any moment of doubt that you...
No, not even. I was born at the Hilldale home there in Hilldale. I grew up on the mountain there in Hilldale. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I just didn't know any other life, of course, and I don't know that I would have loved any other life. And if it came down to me being the last family FLDS in the community, I would have a hard time wanting to stay. I need my religion. I need it. I want it.
Everybody. You just saw Norma. She's an educated, smart woman who refuses to believe all the evidence.
Right. She refuses to look at all the evidence. And the evidence that she has looked at, she refuses to believe. She said herself, I need this religion. For her to face something different would be more shattering to her than just staying where she is, probably knowing in the back of her mind that there's a great deal of truth to it. She just can't look at it.
So you're saying that because her world is so closed, her mind is
Her mind is closed. She is a perfect example of that kind of single-mindedness that people get trapped into.
And I'm right where I want to be. I don't think I want to be out of the culture. I don't want to be out of my religion. I don't need a big gaping hole in my soul. I want to stay where I feel good and comfortable, happy, and fulfilled. And that's my religion does that for me.
So, as you can see, the first clip shows there is definitely something innate in the human mind that wants to be free, with no external reference, without knowing the outside world. She understood that something was wrong. We also have the reverse. Despite some people, they need that belief and they are unwilling to even look at the evidence. There is a reason why we say willful blindness is the defining characteristic of the cult member. I like to think about it this way. Ignorance is rational when the costs of knowledge outweigh the benefits. No one wants to be lied to and exploited, but no one wants to admit that they're lied and exploited. We cannot hope to liberate the mind if we do not understand its limitations. Okay, Benjamin Franklin said, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither. Most people don't think this way, and this was not the choice made by most Western publics following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So if people are willing to give up some of their physical safety, chances are they will also give up some of their psychological safety and security. Okay, I lived in China for 3 years, and there is an assumption, the internet there is totally controlled and censored, and there is an assumption among people working to combat internet censorship that if only we could get the information to the people, then somehow the Chinese would wake up and see the light. Needless to say, this is a little bit simplistic and patronizing. So, a study was done. Does the Great Firewall isolate the Chinese? They found that there was no pattern or no relationship between information or the unenforced containment of information and whether the society was open or closed. In democratic and authoritarian societies alike, most people don't care what the outside world is saying. Okay. So you can see China there is actually the Chinese internet is less isolated than some of the other ones. Human rights have a specific, human rights and law, they are limited in effect. And we have something, and there are two aspects to freedom of mind. There's also freedom of mind as education and a state of being. Law as it is a blunt instrument, whereas education may be more powerful in the long run. We need to find out where in the spectrum of human relationships, what is unethical, what is a criminal offense, and what is a human rights violation. Okay. Here are some examples. So there have been proposals for a declaration of ethical proselytizing, how we can spread religious belief in an ethical manner. Okay. And Ira Sharleff's models of courageous fellowship and intelligent disobedience These can really work to push back the last vestiges of authoritarianism in human society. In the middle of the last Trump presidency, John Kelly purchased a book of the dangerous case of Donald Trump. He noticed the dangers taking place in the Trump administration, and he took action to understand the problem and react accordingly. John Miller, who also served in the Trump administration, he took action to insert himself in the nuclear chain of command to potentially prevent misuse of the nuclear arsenal by Trump. Okay, so I spoke about courageous fellowship and intelligent disobedience. In terms of a meme, we could use this: just say no. No, let's reclaim the word and take it back from the abusers. There's been an explosion of interest in cults in the media and in documentaries. The term narcissist has truly entered the public lexicon. I call it an awakening. It spreads all across the world. This means 不要洗脑. This is in Hong Kong. No to brainwashing in our national education. In Hong Kong and also in China, there's been pushback against attempts by the Chinese government to implement brainwashing programs in the national education. Huge numbers of Hong Kong refugees are fleeing Hong Kong to places in the West for the sake of their children. Likewise, in Turkey too, you're seeing a similar flight to Turkish families. When you ask them, they will say the same thing. We did it for our children. We couldn't put them through that. And most remarkably, about a year and a half ago, during the anti-government protests in China, a translation of the Byte model into Chinese was circulating on Chinese social media. There have been two questions which have driven me through my research. What I always wondered about was not how someone could quote-unquote be so stupid to join a cult, but rather how they could lose their conscience in the process. So it's not that they could be so stupid, but how could they become quote-unquote so evil to commit atrocity? I answered that question a while ago. There is another question. Why and how do evil people do evil? I talked about psychosocial authoritarianism. There is a pathology that drives the instigators of authoritarianism. We cannot hope to understand psychosocial authoritarianism unless we get in the mind of the predator. So, I've been working on documenting the life story of a sociopath called Sean McCraney, who, through a series of life events, including religious epiphany, SSRI medication, starting a family, managed effectively to outgrow his sociopathy and develop emotions that a sociopath would normally not experience: empathy, guilt, remorse, and others.
I know what I am, John. I am a fucker. I'm a criminal. I am a bad human being. I'm demented, John, in my flesh. I'm one of the, Jean-Paul Sartre said, I am the biggest sinner I've ever met. And I would say, no, I am. If you were on the road with me and I didn't have that experience where God took me blind and gave me sight, and you did something to me, I would attack you. I would attack your car. I would attack your wife. I would slit your tires, and I would consider myself in those actions good. I would take your wife if I could. I've done it to other men. I would do whatever my flesh wanted to frickin' do.
Yeah.
When he came in, brother, you became my friend and my neighbor. If there's not a God, I get nothing in my person at all to be considered enlightened, to be considered a good neighbor. There is nothing in Sean McCraney's human soul that came into this earth that cares about good things. I don't care about good things in my flesh. You got to understand that. And so if there is no God, and we can prove there is no God, you enlightened guys, watch the hell out. Because guys like me are not going to make it easy on you. We are going to prey upon you. We are going to take advantage of you. We're going to feed ourselves. We don't care about your enlightened views, about being kind for kindness' sake. We care about ourselves.
In conclusion, I think there are two types of monster. There is the first, who can be, and more importantly, wants to be redeemed. And there is the second, who is devoid of humanity, unwilling to respond to reason or love. I think Sean is the second type. It's only by understanding cases like Sean that we can hope to learn how predators operate and restrain them, and maybe, just maybe, find a cure. Thank you for watching.